Okay, welcome to the first ever online World of the Renaissance art history presentation. And let's see how this goes, shall we? We're going to be looking today at the art of Urbino, which is a city probably a lot of people don't associate with art, but we're going to look at some very important people who were involved with it. Let's just check for a minute where about Urbino is, and if you can see from the map, Urbino is in the Papal States. It's just south east of San Marino, and the fact that it's actually in the Papal States is a very important aspect of what we're going to be looking at. They'll be very relevant as we go on. Let's now look at something from Urbino. Urbino is a walled city in central Italy. It's known for its turreted 15th century Palazzo Ducale. And if you look at this, you can see what a fantastic building that is. This is the Ducal Palace. And obviously it's been added to over the years. You can see different styles as it's gone along. But what a fantastic and very imposing building that is. Now, the most important thing about Urbino is we've got to think in terms of the person who took Urbino over in the 15th century. This is a painting by Pedro Borghetti. He lived from 1450 to 1504. And the painting is Federigo de Montefeltro with his son Guidobaldo. And he was the Duke of Milan. This was painted in 1475. And you can find it in the Palazzo Ducale, that building we've just shown you. Federigo became Duke in 1444. He was a condottiere who was proud of his achievements both militarily and academically. His creative interests were, however, more for literature than for painting. And if you see this picture of him here, there he is with his armour on. There's his young son at his knee. And he's a man of letters, a man of scholarship. One of the things you may look at and notice on his face, you may see that and you may think to yourself, well, that's not a very good painting. He hasn't got the actual crook of the nose very well done. But in fact, that is exactly what he looked like. And we'll come back to that later. This is a detail of the Duke's studiolo with this Vermeer work on it, referred to as illusionistic Antarsia work on the cupboards. And this is a beautifully decorated, basically a studio, a study, where he would read the great scholarly works. And if you look at those Vermeer images there, you've not just got like cupboard fronts, you've got cupboards slightly open, cupboard doors in perspective. You've got things hanging on the shelves, hanging from the shelves, casting shadows. And this is all illusionistic, and it is absolutely fantastic. Sorry I haven't got the name of the person who did this, but there we go. You can't win them all. Now let's turn to our first artist, who I want to look at. And a very great artist, somebody who's very important in the early Renaissance. And this is the artist Piero della Francesca. He lived from somewhere around 1415 to 20 and died in 1492. And this is the Duke and Duchess of Urbino. This was painted somewhere between 1467 to 72, and it's in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And can you see the bridge of the nose of the Duke? That he is, in fact, he's got basically a deformed face. That's because this was a sword wound that he was inflicted on him in battle, and it's something that he hasn't asked the artist to cover up at all, but it's something that he's he wants people to see. Notice the way they're both painted in profile. We've spoken about this before, about how this is the way Roman emperors were portrayed on coins, and the fact that they see themselves, as people very much in charge, very imperial sorts of people. But let's get on with Piero della Francesca. He was born in Borgo San Sepolcro in Tuscany, but is associated with Urbino. He was basically commissioned by the Duke. Now this is the wonderful Baptism of Christ that's in the National Gallery, London, painted somewhere around 1437. The background is based on Borgo San Sepolcro, and he was the first artist to actually write a treatise on perspective. Now, when you look at this picture, this is a very large painting. It's about 7 or 8 foot high. One of the things I've always point out about it is its use of perspective. We can see a little bit of like single point perspective. There's the way in which this strange, is that a path or is that a stream? I don't know, but it's what the figures are being baptized in. It seems to lead away into the painting, and it seems to go towards that city wall there. You get the feeling of things getting smaller as they get further away. But the really important thing is that the detail in the background is so very interesting. It's like those figures in the foreground have this incredible monumentality. That's something I would say about Piero della Francesca. He really was a painting of monumental figures. And yet, when you look in the background, it's incredibly fiddly. There's a lot of detail. Things get smaller. There's a lot of small bushes. There's a lot of small areas of like chalk in the hills in the background, and then he gets even more fiddly and he kind of fills those areas of chalk with little dots, little bushes. And what he's doing is he's making an incredibly fiddly, small scale background and comparing it to this incredibly monumental foreground with the figure of Christ, John the Baptist, and of course the 3 angels, and even the tree. They're really big visual statements, and then there's all this small fiddly stuff, and I don't know what the name you would give to this type of perspective. It's something that I've never really seen before in any other artists, but it's one of my favourite Renaissance depictions of perspective and a sense of depth, which I think is marvellous. My only problem with this painting is that beard that John the Baptist has got, which I think he got from a joke shop, and also the dove looks a little bit three-dimensional, but we'll forgive him for that. Let's move on to our next painting, which is called The Flagellation of Christ. And this is again in the Palazzo Ducale. Now, when you look at this painting, I've always thought that this painting is a massive sort of, almost like a fresco type, monumental thing. And it's, obviously to be hung quite high, because if you look at the eye line of the perspective, the actual, what we might call the horizon line, is very, very low. It's down by Christ's feet. It's underneath Pilate's feet, that dais that he's sitting on over on the left. We seem to be at that level. So I always assumed that this was actually a painting quite high up in a building. In fact, it's only about 2 foot wide. It's a tiny painting. And the strange perspective is fascinating. I think what it does for us is actually puts us at Christ's feet. We're actually kneeling down. Although Christ himself is being abused, whipped, we're actually still kneeling before him. He's tied to a pillar that has a classical image, like a Roman god. That I find very interesting when you think about, this being the Romans who are mistreating him. Pilate is dressed interestingly as well. He's wearing Saladin's hat, so they portrayed him as being Moorish. But the big question about this painting that a lot of people have not been able to work out is who these 3 figures on the right are. I mean, obviously they're important people. They may have had something to do with the commissioning of the painting, but we don't actually know who they are. Some people have suggested there's a theological, spiritual aspect to this, and what they're actually doing is they're just standing by. This is like a lesson to us. Are we actually people who are kneeling before Christ, or are we just standing by, ignoring what's going on? It's a fascinating and wonderful painting. If we look at the Resurrection painting now, this is in the Museo Civico San Sepolcro. He was commissioned to paint the fresco for San Sepolcro Gothic-style Residenza, the communal meeting hall which was used solely by conservatori, the chief magistrates and governors, who, before starting their councils, would pray before this image. And again, there's something here. Notice the eye line. The eye line is the top of the actual tomb that Christ is coming out of. So he's above our eye line. And this, when you have the for sleeping soldiers, that is a typical technique to actually place us in the same space as those who are falling, like the sleeping disciples in Gethsemane, or here the sleeping temple guards. But towering above them is Christ with the flag of St. George, absolutely triumphant. You'll notice over on the left of him there's those dead trees, but over on the right the trees are alive, and this is a painting all about life coming from death. A wonderful triumphant image. Another image which is to be found in the National Gallery is of St. Michael. And this is painted for the Augustinian Church of Borgo San Sepolcro. I'll get this right eventually. And we've seen lots of pictures of St. Michael, the archangel, who drove the great serpent, the devil, out of heaven. But here we have him, instead of driving Satan out, he's actually cut his head off, which is interesting. But again, look how the monumental aspect of Michael, he really fills that image. He absolutely dominates that picture. He really is in charge. And he's standing on the serpent. And this, I find this very, very interesting, because in some ways there's something theologically wrong with this painting. St. Michael in the Bible didn't cut off the serpent's head. It talks about Christ. There's a prediction in Genesis 3 about Christ, the seed of the woman, would actually come and crush the serpent's head. And I find this interesting, and I don't know why this is. It's theologically wrong, but it's fascinating. It makes me wonder if there was something behind the scenes, behind the person who commissioned it, that they had something to do with that. Let's look at our last Piero della Francesca painting, and it's of the Nativity, again in the National Gallery, London. It was one of his last paintings created before his death, and if you look at it, it's actually seems unfinished. There are two figures in the background at the right whose faces aren't finished. I'm wondering actually whether that foreground, it looks like sort of a very sandy foreground, whether that's actually finished. It may be. But a very wonderful painting. I think Piero della Francesca, there's something very still, something very peaceful about his work, which I like very much. But my favourite part of this is the fact, if you look at the quintet of singers, the 5 singers, 2 of whom in the front have mandolins or lutes, and if you look at each singer, their mouth is in a different position. So there's one with the mouth closed in the middle, slightly open on the left, slightly open but in a different position on the right, and then a little bit more open at the back left, and then the back right, the mouth is completely open. And of course what this is depicting is harmonies, harmonious singing. And one can't help, whenever I look at these figures, I can hear the singing. I think it's very, very beautiful. And so there is Piero della Francesca. Hope you've enjoyed that, because he's one of my favourites, and I think he's worth looking at. The great art educationalist Geoffrey Camp, who wrote a lot about painting, suggested to students that they actually copy Francesca, particularly his baptism of Christ. And I do remember when you used to see a lot of copyists in the National Gallery. The baptism of Christ was one that was actually very popular with copyists. But let's move on a little bit now. We're going to go on to something else about Urbino, and that was that Urbino was a major centre for majolica ware. This is a type of ceramic. It was made by a tin glaze process, resulting in an opaque white glazed surface decorated with brush painting in metal oxide enamel colours. And this is a little example that I actually found in Petworth House. I actually took this photograph with my mobile phone. Sorry about the quality, but I thought it was very beautiful. And this was in an exhibition to do with depictions of sky. And what it depicts there is St. John the Divine, who wrote the book of Revelation. And there you have an angel appearing out of the sky. And the curator of the museum, the curator of the collection rather, obviously thought that this was a very interesting depiction of sky, actually on ceramic. And yes, this is actually borrowed. It was in Petworth House, but it was borrowed from the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. So if you want to go and see that, here it is. There's another majolica ware jug in this case. I'm afraid I don't have any information about this, only that it is rather beautiful and it is rather distinct, isn't it? The glazing, the painted glaze, is really quite good. It's quite artistic. If you look at that typically Renaissance female head on the front there, and the way in which that dark blue shadow is going around it, I quite like that. In fact, I would say that is almost a bit 20th century. It's really quite a rich, beautiful thing. And then the next one I just want to show you is this wonderful vase, or jar. And do people remember this? When we were looking at the Ottomans, and was it the Ottomans? No, it wasn't. It was the Spanish, and we were looking at the Moorish artwork of early Spain, and how they created these jars, which were called pharmacy jars. And remember, their medical expertise was far superior to that of the rest of Europe, the rest of the world for that matter. And obviously these had something to do with the pharmacy. But this style has continued, and this is what this is, and I still see jars like this. So this is based on a Moorish shape, but very much a Renaissance decoration, Italian Renaissance decoration. A very beautiful thing. Let's move on now. Now, I'm going to show you a picture here. You may find this strange to have this in an Italian town, an Italian city, but this is by the master of the St Bartholomew altarpiece, active from 1470 to 1510. It's called Saints Peter and Dorothy. You didn't know there was a Saint Dorothy, did you? Painted around 1505, and it's in the National Gallery, London. And if you look at it, you look at the folds, there's very quite hard sort of geometric folds in the fabric. And if you look at the way the faces are depicted, it looks incredibly Flemish. It looks like more like something that would be in Germany. Going from Flanders to Germany than going to Italy. But I think we need to remember that the influence on painters, a lot of painters in Italy, and particularly in Urbino, in the early days, it was Flemish. And so this is the type of thing and the influence that was coming in to Urbino at the time. The flowers refer to a miracle that occurred after Dorothy's execution. So there we go. Things flowered after her execution, which is a sign that she really was a saint. Let's look now at more of an Urbino artist. This is somebody else whose work can be seen in the National Gallery in London, and this is Luca Signorelli. Born somewhere between 1440 and 1450, died in 1523. This is a painting from 1490, roundabouts then. It's of the circumcision. And immediately, what always strikes me when I see this in the National Gallery, of course, is the colour. Look at that. First of all, that checkerboard colour on the floor that they're standing on. Those tiles reminds me a little bit of the floor in Saturday Night Fever that John Travolta used to dance on. Wonder if they light up. But if you actually see those same colours echoed in the wall behind them, a strange marbled colour. Most interesting. And then the rich colours, those two gowns in the foreground, that deep burgundy on the right and this sort of saffron orange on the left. Very interesting. It was made for the oratory of the Company of the Holy Name of Jesus in Volterra in Tuscany. Now, Signorelli's uncle was Giorgio Vasari's great-grandfather. And Vasari, who we've met before, claims that Signorelli was actually apprenticed to Piero della Francesca. So there's a connection there. But I'll leave you just to have a look at that. That's really quite a wonderful painting before we go on to the next one by Signorelli, which is The Last Judgment. And it's painted in 1499, and it was painted for the Orvietta Cathedral, which is part of the Papal States. Now, this is why it's important that we remember that Urbino was in the Papal States. So they was a close connection with the papacy, and they would actually be commissioning work. This is a very terrifying work, although it is actually very early, 1499. We're not even into the 16th century. It has already a sort of a feeling of what we're going to look at and call counter-reformation work. This really is the church putting its stamp on the human mind and talking about the reality of hell, the reality of the Last Judgment. And it is pretty terrifying, I have to say. It is actually a fresco, and it's actually 30 to 40 foot wide, somewhere around that, very, very wide. And as I say, painted to actually really put the stamp of the papal authority on the human mind, saying that papacy was actually in charge. Do you remember when we were looking at Rome, and we were saying how it was, actually quite a newbie sort of state. Rome had been a dreadful place after the fall of the Roman Empire. It was in a real mess. And, places like, Byzantium and the Holy Roman Empire, they had far more, clout, far more stability than Rome. And so Rome had to compete with them. So this is really what we're looking at, what Rome is doing here. A fascinating and rather terrifying painting. Let's now look at another painting which is in the National Gallery in London. And this is by Pietro Perugino, living from 1469, died in 1523, and it's called The Virgin and Child with an Angel, the Archangel Raphael with Tobias and the Archangel Michael. Painted between 1496 and 1500, again in the National Gallery, London, painted for side chapel of the Charterhouse in Pavia. And what can we say about this? Well, I'd like you to draw your attention to the faces, and also I'd like to draw your attention to the aerial perspective, the fact that the landscapes get, as they go further away from the viewer, they get greyer, colder, bluer, which is very, very convincing. I'd like you to look at the sky, and I'd like you to look at the way the sky seems to glow. I think that is a fantastic technique. You can say, oh, so what, but that is a really marvellous achievement to see an artist do that. And most of all, I'd like you to look at the faces, because it's very easy to look at a painting like this and mistake it for somebody who we're going to look at in a minute, and that is Raphael. You can tell that Raphael was very influenced by Perugino. The aerial perspective, the glowing sky, and the very rather sweet, peaceful, graceful faces, they are very much something that Raphael picked up on. And if you look at an early Raphael, sometimes I think it's quite difficult to tell the difference between Raphael and Perugino. So let's move on now to our second star of the show. After Piero della Francesca, the next person we need to look at is the son of the man who painted this. This is actually painted by Giovanni Santi. He lived from around 1435, died in 1494, and it's called Christ Supported by Two Angels. Painted around 1490, and it's in the Museum of Fine Art in Budapest. And immediately, some of you may recognise that it is a subject which became popular after 1450. And this is a portrayal of the body of Christ filling up like 3/4 of the painting, and just presided over by an angel either side. And you'll remember that in 1450 this became something that the church was very keen to for artists to portray. There was a Saint Gregory who had a vision. Just sneezing, glad you're not with me. Who had a vision of the body of Christ and how important the body of Christ was in the Eucharist. And so this again was the church stamping its authority and wanting to really emphasise the bodily, the body of Christ, the physicality of Christ and the physicality of his death and his bleeding. What is very odd for this painting is that you've actually got a fly on his chest. I don't know why. What the only reason why I can think that's there is because it's really emphasising the physicality of his of Christ's body. I've heard that it doesn't take long for flies to actually find a dead corpse. They come quite quickly, and this seems to be what Giovanni Santi is actually doing. But the thing we need to remember about Giovanni Santi was that he was the father of Raphael, who we're going to be looking at. Santi studied under Della Francesca, and he was court painter to the Duke of Urbino. Santi was also a poet, so that would have put him in good stead with the Duke of Urbino, who was more of a literary man than a lover of visual art. There are also sorts of things we need to take into account. The fact that Raphael grew up as the son of a court painter meant that he understood court etiquette. It may have some reason why he rose to fame so quickly, was because he was able to actually charm the people of influence. He knew how to do that. This is another painting by Giovanni Santi. In 1482, Federico had died, and he was succeeded by his son Girolamo, who married Elisabetta Gonzaga. So the Gonzaga family are another famous Renaissance family. So obviously people are keeping it in the family. They're all influential families marrying each other. This one here is the meeting of Mary and Elizabeth, painted in 1490. It's in the National Gallery of the Marcia, Castle of the Dukes of Urbino. But I think this has been photographed from a book because it's very faded over one side. But anyway, again, I think if you think of both of these paintings, if we think of the one of the body of Christ and we think of this one, they're very Flemish looking, they're very hard. The fabric is very hard, the creases are very hard. And it's difficult to look at these and think to yourself, well, this is a distinctive painter, because it's very, very much of a muchness. A typical Flemish artist, not really very much you can say. It looks like a lot of other Flemish artists. But all that changes when we come to Giovanni Santi's son, who's what we know as Raphael. And this is a self-portrait, a drawing he did of himself when he was 16. And doesn't that make you feel sick? It is absolutely beautiful. Already you can see that grace, that simplicity. He doesn't put down too much information. He just puts enough down to get it across. And he seems to be a young lad who thinks quite a lot of himself, thinks he's, got a chance with the ladies. And, what can you say? I many people have said to really understand Raphael, you have to see his drawing. His drawings are absolutely exquisite, and I would agree. Let's go now to a painting, and here is the Mons Crucifixion, which was in the National Gallery, London. Painted when he was 20 for a church in Città di Castello, Perugia, Northumbria. Sorry, this isn't that good an image. It's not the best image I could have found. Sorry about that. But it's an enormous painting. It's about 12 foot high. The figures are almost life size. But in this one you can see this is early Raphael, because if you look at the faces, they're incredibly like Perugino. The aerial perspective is very much like that, the glowing sky. He hasn't really become Raphael, but it's still a fantastic picture, and there's so much I could say about this. The one of the things I always find odd is that chocolate brown earth that the saints at the bottom of the painting are actually standing on. I mean, that would be very, very muddy, and you'd get those gowns very dirty. But of course the chocolate brown really comes forwards, as opposed to the landscape, which gets colder and bluer as it goes away. You'll notice the way that the angels are catching the blood from the wounds of Christ, from the hands and from his side. Again, this is a reference to the Eucharist, the importance of it. I've always liked those angels' tassels, the way they kind of fill in the negative space. They kind of do a dance in the air. And Raphael's a very pretty painter. I don't really think he does religious subjects that well. If you look at the blood that's actually flowing from the wounds, it's hardly red at all. If you look at the actual painting, it's almost like a really downplayed. But he gives Christ a red loincloth, which I find really very, very interesting. Maybe that's where he kind of tidying it all up. The blood of the sacrifice is just kept to the colour of his loincloth. Look at the way the saints are arranged almost choreographically at the bottom, this is a fantastic depiction of Raphael was very inspired by Leonardo's ideas of composition. Leonardo, of course, was a lot older than him, and this idea that you have this pyramid structure in a painting, and he followed that very, very closely. Here is another one. It's just called An Allegory, Vision of a Night, and this is in the National Gallery as well. As you can see, the faces are still, it's an interesting painting. It's obviously very small because you can see all the brush strokes. It's just a little painting. This is, you know, probably this may have even been to be inset in a piece of furniture, you know, a cupboard or something like that. But you see the faces are still very much like Perugino, but an interesting painting. Yeah. Let's move on and let's get to some proper Raphael, shall we? And let's look at this one, which is the Madonna of the Meadow. And this is actually wasn't painted in Urbino, where he was born and grew up. This was actually painted in Florence. Again, it's very much has the look of a Leonardo da Vinci in the composition, the way in which that Madonna creates a great big triangle in the composition. It's very strong. The background is again, it's this aerial perspective. It's showing this the influence of the Flemish painters. The midground and foreground is really sort of devoid of colour, which is I find very interesting. It's almost like it's kind of like been bleached out, or someone's gone over it with a tea bag to make it go brown. But it seems that impurity makes the colours, the blue and the red on the Madonna, that much sharper, that much purer. Because if you isolate those colours, they're not necessarily that pure. The red is a kind of sombre red, as is the blue, but the impurity around it, the colour, really makes that shine out. And I think this is wonderful, and we're getting to proper Raphael with this painting. Raphael was somebody who didn't really hang around very much. He often used to go from place to place. And he didn't spend a great deal of time in Florence, but we do have an extract of a letter, and here it is: recommendation of Raphael, dated October 1504, from the mother of the next Duke of Urbino to the Confalonier of Florence. And it says, the bearer of this will be found to be Raphael, painter of Urbino, who, being greatly gifted in his profession, has determined to spend some time in Florence to study. And because his father was most worthy, I was very attached to him, and the son is a sensible and well-mannered young man on both accounts. I bear him great love. Well, that's a bit nonsensical, because actually Raphael wasn't like that at all. He was a complete and utter brawler and a drunkard. And but he knew people in high places who could be of influence to him. This next painting is called St. Catherine of Alexandria, painted around 1507 in the National Gallery, London, and it's towards the end of his Florentine period. He created this, again influenced by Leonardo. If you look at the way the hands are, especially that one hand across her chest, it's very Da Vinci-esque. Another beautiful piece of Raphael. This really is really good. I mean, there's something about this that it really does stand out from those Flemish paintings, or even the ones of Della Francesco. She's not a statue. She's monumental, but she's a real person. There she is, leaning on her wheel, which was the method of her torture and execution, and she's looking up to the heavenly light. And you look at the colours she's wearing the primary colours, red, yellow and blue, and then she's got that wonderful green sleeve coming round. And look at that face, look at those eyes. It's still a little bit like Perugino, the face, but it's getting more to be a Raphael face. Yeah, I could look at this for some time. I think it's an absolutely gorgeous picture. And of course, you can at any moment, I think with this this video, you can press the pause button, and you can stop any of these if you want to look at anything. Let's look at a wonderful portrait he did. I'm really staggered by this, because if somebody was to say who painted this, I might say, well, it looks like a Dutch 17th century painting. Is it Frans Hals? But it's not. This is Raphael as well. And it's a portrait of Baldassare Castiglione. And it's actually in the Louvre. It was painted around 1514. And Castiglione and Raphael were great friends. Castiglione's book, The Courtier, described life in the Urbino court under the literary influence of Elisabetta Gonzaga. So it was, it was a kind of a fly on the wall type of book, and it just told people about what happened in these higher echelons of civic life. I guess it's like the beginning of Hello Magazine and all this type of thing. It was a way of looking in on the courts and discussing and finding out how things happened in the court, how the other half lived. But what a fantastic painting. I mean, this really is great Raphael. He was a great painter, and the way in which those eyes are looking at us. There's a feeling in the face that reminds me of Frans Hals, because it looks as if he's suddenly turning, as if he's in mid-expression. There's even a feeling on the fur, on the shoulders of his clothing there. There's these kind of horizontal lines that look like blur lines that give the whole the whole figure sort of a sense of movement, but it's a very subtle movement, which is typical of Raphael, because what Raphael was all about was grace. And this is what you're seeing here, and quite beautiful. I mean, I just want to show you some drawings by Raphael. We will look at drawings again by him because they're fantastic, but this is just a study for the three graces. And we have mentioned before, I mean, Michelangelo. It always looks like Michelangelo is in fact drawing male models and just putting female lumps on them and that type of thing, but you don't get that with Raphael. You do get with Raphael, you really do get the feeling that you're looking at women, and he was a great lover of women, yes, and he was also he used female models, which was actually quite unusual. Very often it was seemed the correct thing was to use male models more. But he did like his female models, and this one here looks like it's actually combined. It's a drawing of the same woman 3 times, which and the whole way he worked. He used to have lots of drawings, and he used to lay them out on his studio floor and work out compositions from them, which is his working method is a little bit more like a more modern artist. So he was quite ahead of his time. Let's just look at one last painting. This one's actually by Titian, and it's a painting which shocks some people. You can think what you like, but I wanted to look at this because it's, of course, Titian's The Venus d'Urbino, The Venus of Urbino, and so I thought we ought to look at it. Does it really have anything to do with Urbino? It's a very beautiful painting. I've always thought the woman's face is very, very lovely, but it's also a very cheeky painting. She seems to have a bunch of flowers which she's not holding on to like a sort of a posy. She looks like she's about to throw them at somebody, which seems to be a sort of a come on. She's got servants in the background, sort of maybe they're looking for some clothes or something else. But it's a very erotically charged painting. But as for its connection with Urbino, it was bought at Titian's Venetian studio in 1538 by Guidobaldo II della Rovere, Duke of Camerino. The descendant of the Dukes of Urbino had solicited the purchase of a painting portraying a nude young woman in the artist's studio from his agent in Venice, and he asked insistently his mother, Eleonora Gonzaga, for money to buy it. Guidobaldo's mother thought that his son's desire was only a tantrum and didn't want to pay out even a ducat. So Guidobaldo had to reassure Titian many times about the fact that he would pay for the painting to prevent the artist from selling the canvas to someone else. So that is the connection. It was actually bought by one of the Dukes of Urbino, but that's as far as its connection goes. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed that, and my voice has come across. You may have had to turn me up a bit, but let's see how we get on. This will be the first one. I'm intending to put this on YouTube, and you can actually put comments, or you can email me comments or any questions at all about it, and let's just see how we get on with that. Okay, thank you very much, and stay well.